It's no secret that we're all unique. With over 85 billion neurons and over 600 trillion synaptic connections that are constantly adapting to our internal and external environments, neurodiversity and uniqueness are baked into our brains and evolution. So why do so many of our education and work environments fail to recognize and harness this diversity? That's at the heart of today's episode. With the help of Dr. Jason Rogers, an expert on neurodiversity and learning, we look at what the current changes in science, perception, and application of neurodiversity mean for education, business, and leadership. Welcome to episode 41 of the Working Well podcast, the show that explores the rapidly changing landscape of work and well-being. Each episode, we dive into the hottest topics in leadership, employee well-being, and the future of work. I'm your host, Tim Boris. Now, before we dive in, let's learn a bit more about Jason. Dr. Jason Rogers is a passionate advocate for education and neurodiversity. With a doctorate in education, he understands the science of learning, and as a dyslexic, he has first-hand experiences with the challenges and opportunities of neurodiversity in school, business, and life. Jason is head of school at Rundle College Society, an innovative K-12 independent academic co-educational day school in Calgary with approximately 1,200 students. During his time at Rundle, Jason has spearheaded the Rundle Academy redesign, a project aiming to create a bespoke facility for students with learning disabilities, the construction of the state-of-the-art Collette School, and developed the Learning Studio at Rundle, an innovative incubator empowering teachers to create and study their dream teaching spaces. Jason, so great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining me today.
And, of course, great to be here.
Yeah. You've had a interesting journey to get where you are today. Tell me a little bit more about that journey and how you got to what you're doing now.
Well, that's a big, wide open question. I'll try to keep it condensed, but I have to start at the beginning, honestly, Tim. I'm in education. Well, I'll start at the end. I'm in education right now. I'm privileged and to serve as the head of school here at Rundle for all of our schools. And I think I'm a pretty unlikely head of school given my background. And so to take you right back to the beginning, I'm not a confident or a strong learner by nature. As a young person, I always struggled with learning, came to find much later that it was dyslexia that was holding me back. I was generally unable to read until forever, generally. Didn't finish a novel or a book in my K-12 experience and, really leveraged the strengths of others to get me through school. And so, my background in learning is that of struggle, frankly. I really spent a lot of my life feeling like I wasn't able to learn, wasn't capable of learning, that the education system generally wasn't for me. In good fortune, I suppose, both my parents are educators, and they work tirelessly to help support me through those formative years and those years of deep challenge and misunderstanding of my own neural diversity, if you will. And, through that support and the support of a lot of other people, I managed to get my way into university. When I was in university, I tried a couple of degrees. I tried a chemistry degree because I was pretty good at that in high school. That didn't work out. Tried a business degree because I was pretty entrepreneurial in my whole life. That didn't work out. And then I stumbled into a course called Education for Exceptional Learners at the University of Saskatchewan about 1997. And it was in that moment where I realized, first of all, that my learning was diverse, and the fact that I had severe and profound challenges with reading written text. And secondly, that there were a lot of ways to support learners like me and other students who had challenges. And that became my true passion in life. So I became an educator, middle years specializing, but did additional specialties in special education. Went on to work in the inner city of Saskatoon at a beautiful school called Princess Alexandra Community School, where I had the privilege of working, in grade 3 to 5, then grade 6 to 8, and then in a resource room. And then came out to a school in Calgary called Rundle Academy. And Rundle Academy specialized in students who have learning disabilities, grade 4 to grade 12. And I spent 15 years teaching and leading there. And then in 2014, I was able to take on the headship of all of Rundle and oversee all 3 programs here. So kind of gives you a snapshot of, I think what is a fairly unlikely journey to becoming, head of an independent school here in Calgary.
Your background and experience set you up perfectly for what you're doing. And, I'm call it neuronormative in learning. I have a close personal friend who was one of my best friends through high school and university who had dyslexia or has dyslexia. And she's one of the most brilliant people I know. And I talked to her a lot about her experience when she was growing up in the school system. And just like you had parents who were educators and were able to get you the help. Her family had the resources to hire tutors and look into what was happening. And she's got a PhD now and done her MBA, and she's just brilliant. And she always has been, but in this traditional school system, that wasn't set up for her. And as you experienced, that's not how most traditional education, particularly 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you didn't fit the mold, you got spit out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a very big risk that we still face today, but we certainly faced, back in the day in the 80s when I was in, K-12 education. But I think, the gifts that came from having a disability, and having a disability still is that, the work ethic had to be there. I think I probably worked as hard or harder than anybody I knew. And secondly, I learned how to network really early. You can think of that traditional group project in grade 6 where you've got 5 or 6 students in that group. Well, if you're the kid in that group who can't read or follow directions, you got to find a way to get the project done on your own terms. So you got to find somebody who can read and follow directions. You got to find somebody else who can do different things inside that project. And then you're able to bring that network ability and that, probably a pretty divergent way of thinking into the project, which will allow, probably extraordinary outcomes that aren't, realized when everybody's thinking the same way. And so I think that was a true benefit of, struggling with reading and struggling with learning the way I did all the way through school. And I think truly it helps me in today's workplace. It allows me to, be much more empathetic towards, workers who think differently, or employees or friends or colleagues, and students, and helping them reach their potential in spite of whatever challenge they might face.
Yeah. And you brought up a couple of good points there, and the power that comes from being able to approach problems and solutions from a different perspective. We're seeing that a lot in the workplace today on DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and people are talking a lot more about the power of that in the workforce. But I think, I'd say education is a lot further ahead of the curve than it's like the workforce lags behind, because as people get out into the workforce and they've had a certain educational experience, they will be able to bring that hopefully to the workforce. What are you seeing in education right now that is, I guess, shaping the workforce of the future?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting because, Tim, I think it goes both ways, honestly. I mean, some places, some work environments, I think, are far more advanced than education are, far more accepting of different ways of working, different ways of thinking. You think about the tech sector, for instance, and, I'd spent some time in San Francisco and Vancouver, visiting, technology offices and viewing how they work with their workforces and what kind of accommodations they have and how they're building, spaces where people can embrace wellness and productivity and purpose all at the same time. And spend some time in those spaces and then try to bring that back to a K-12 education. So not only our teachers, but our students can benefit from some of that flexibility, everything from mobile seating to, I'm at a standing desk here today to, more flexible schedules. All of those things can be taken from what I think are innovative and advanced workforces. Then you look at education, and obviously some of the things happening in education, be it around, purpose-driven lives, and we're seeing that more and more with our students wanting to live lives of purpose over profit. I think our students are really valuing things like their personal wellness over, maybe corporate success. Now, it's not to say that they are exclusive of each other, because I think one benefits the other as much as anything. But I think students are looking to the space of, what does my mental well-being look like? How do I support myself in that? What's my understanding of my own mental wellness? And how do I articulate that and advocate for myself in the things that I need? So I think we're seeing, a bit of give and take from the workforce to K-12 education. I think where potentially the largest challenge is that in-between stage. And I think post-secondary education is the slowest to change. I think it's like the biggest, most unmovable beast in all of this. The bureaucracy is larger, and it's more entrenched. And so you see fewer accommodations. You see less understanding of, learning diversity. You're seeing less adaptability when it comes to innovation and workplace and advancement in that space. And I think some of the largest work needs to happen in that kind of in-between bit. And I think there's a nice give and take, honestly, between the corporate world and K-12. And I think, we could see a little bit more movement in post-secondary. We might all benefit.
I would agree that post-secondary could use a change. And I think it does vary dramatically between institutions, programs. I have to say, I've just last year, I went back and did a graduate certificate in executive coaching, and I was really impressed with the Royal Roads experience and how they, particularly that CEC program, was structured very much based on adult learning and divergent learning styles and interactive and collaborative. I thought it was fantastic. Again, tied to the program, the content of the program, whether it was an executive accounting program. I don't know if it would be that different, but I can't speak to that. But I did see that. I can say from, as a consultant going into organizations, you're right, it does vary widely. The tech sector tends to lead the way. However, there are still a lot of companies out there that I think are starting to talk a good game or speak differently about what's happening. But when you really just even scratch barely below the surface, it's still the same mindset. And I think that's, in a good way, creating some conflict in the workplace, because companies are marketing this, but the day-to-day reality of the organization is quite different. And I still think people with a neurodivergent way of thinking or perspective are not as celebrated as you would like to think, particularly in under more traditional leadership styles.
So, Tim, you bring up an interesting point. I'd like to just maybe put back to you a little bit. I mean, I wonder if it's about size, size of organizations, size of structures, size of systems. You talk about Royal Roads, and when you talk about Royal Roads, I think of Huron University in Ontario as well. And they're smaller systems, right? Where you're able to really hone in on the individual, the personalization. And we certainly see that at the school, Rundle here. I mean, our class sizes are 14 students at the very, very largest. And even though, we've got 12 or 1,300 students in our entire system, we pride ourselves on being small and thinking small, thinking down to the individual and trying to understand who that person is, what they need, how we can support them, how do they reach their potential. But perhaps the real challenge, like as we're talking about with, traditional post-secondary education, is you're looking at lectures of 600 students in an intro psychology course. How could you, in any way recognize a diversity in that room, and address it through a pedagogical approach? I don't think it's possible. And I think size might be one of the biggest barriers that universities face, and maybe corporations as well. And you do see it in larger education systems too, that size seems to be a barrier to being empathetic and addressing neural diversity in the workplace or in education.
Yes, I would agree with you. Size does make it more challenging, especially when there's the further the disconnect from senior leadership to, call it line level employees or students or the general consumers of the product or information. It does make it harder. I still think there's a way, though. I'm going back. I'm going back to 91 to 96 when I was in university the first time. And I know in your TED talk, you talked about listening to audio cassettes in the truck when you were driving around. And I was at Simon Fraser, and my psychology lectures were a couple hundred students in the lecture hall. And I was playing sports at the time, so I missed a lot of lectures. So they did record them, and I would have to go to the library and listen to the cassettes. But I found that super helpful. And, obviously now with online and recordings in a, cloud server, you can go do that. And then we had meetings with our TA to go sit and talk through the lecture material. And that, again, was super helpful for me because I found that I had trouble concentrating. I remember particularly, I as a young athlete, I probably stayed up later than I wanted. Some of the classes were 8 a.m. And I guarantee I learned about 5% of what I could have learned in those morning lectures. And I actually stopped going after a while because I knew I wasn't learning anything. I just listened to the cassettes and talked to the TA. And I still ended up getting good marks, but it was ability to adapt to that. And I think organizations that can provide that will really, as you said, help grow the superpowers in people.
Yeah, and I think and that's the primary challenge that we've been trying to solve at our newest program called Rundle Studio, Tim. And I think the Rundle Academy program has about 250 students in it, and they all have learning disabilities. They all 100% graduate, 100% go on to post-secondary. But what we know is that in the population, there's between 15 and 20% of people who would qualify as having a diagnosed learning disability, which is like not extreme, but it's a profound neural diversity. So if we have 15 to 20% of people in the population who could benefit from a program like Rundle Academy, how can we scale that effectively? And if you're going to scale it, you have to scale it by having the same tenets in place, being trust, personalization, care, empathy, and great universally designed instruction. And so we've been working hard on that in the Rundle Studio program, which is a virtualized school for students who are neurally diverse from grade 7 to grade 10 right now, and eventually be grade 7 to grade 12. And what we found is, if we have one instructor who's a content expert, so think of the best teacher you've ever had. We take that best teacher and they provide the content in bite-size information packets, similar to what you're talking about. And then we're able to take other teacher advisors and have them personalize that information and deeply connect it to the way that the neurally divergent student learns. Then we're able to get the 1-2 punch of best instruction, best personalization, and hopefully we're setting those students up for success, well beyond the confines of brick and mortar school like Rundle Academy that has a limitation of having 250 students, when we know, there's 100 times that in the province of Alberta who could use that support. So yeah, exactly. I think it comes back to, we're trying to crack that code, is how do we create opportunity and access to students who are neurally divergent in a scalable way that's not confined by bricks and mortar.
I love that you brought that up. It's it obviously is very timely with what's gone on the last few years and remote work, and so many leaders thought, oh, people can't work remotely and people won't like it. And there's been a huge shift in how people see that and what work they do at certain times versus others. And I guess how to scale that. So what are the biggest learnings that have come out for you over the past, working through Render Studio with the virtualized program that you think would apply to the future of education, but also the workforce?
Yeah. Thank you. I think, first is not for everybody. Okay. So like, yeah, I think it'll work for 50% of people, but I think 50% of people just never work for. I think, for the 50% it works for. So once you get down to that, I think having personal human connection is really important on a regular basis. So, whether it's, a 15-minute check-in at the start of the lesson or, check-in at the end of the day. And that translates to the corporate workplace just as well as it does to education, is the fact that working in total isolation, I don't think is a solution to many of our kind of corporate or educational challenges. So that's the first thing. Second thing, we come back to universal design for learning at the studio and allowing students to access material when and however they need it. So, like you said about your psychology class, having some of that information captured so that they can get it when they're best ready to accept it is really helpful. So we know that, Dan Pink wrote a great book a couple of years ago called When, and he talks about, the cycles of our conscious, basically, when we're at our peak efficacy, whether it's in the morning, during the day, or at night. And all of us have different biometric cycles like that. So if a student is best able to learn at night, then having that information available to them at night when they're best able to learn is really valuable. And there are some students who are, morning birds too, who like to be up first thing in the morning, and having access when and how they need it is really important. Second to that is, inside the universal design is allowing things to be available in text, in audio, having both varieties. So for students who are able to read really well, maybe that's their choice way of taking it in. Whereas students like me who are better listeners than we're readers, having that ability to listen to material has been really beneficial as well. I think, having that regular access, that human connection, is the center points of what we're doing at the studio that allow students to remain engaged, remain connected, and remain learning throughout their time online. And beyond that, Tim, as you know, like inside the corporate world or education, the benefits that come from working remotely sometimes outweigh the drawbacks. And I'll use examples like the faculty that we have at the studio program enjoy a lot more flexibility in their life than teachers who work in a brick and mortar school. They're able to go to their kitchen and make their lunch. They're able to drop their kids off at school in the morning and show up to work at a little bit later in the day, as long as their lessons are pre-recorded and they've got those check-ins booked for their students. They've got more flexibility. So we're finding that for some professionals, the flexibility has been really, really beneficial. And I think we don't see that in the education sector all that often. And it's becoming more and more prevalent post-COVID. So I think that's been a big benefit as well.
Well, I like that you said the, personal connection with the students. What does that typically look like? Can you map that out?
Yeah. So effectively, over the course of a year, what teachers are doing is they're working with students to first help them understand where their learning challenge or difference is. So, and how it manifests inside each of their subject areas, because it can manifest differently in math than from social studies than from art class. So over the course of the year, first is understanding and awareness. And secondly, it's advocacy. So I think this pivot from understanding awareness to advocacy is really important in education and the workforce, because you're not able to advocate for yourself unless you have a deep understanding of who you are as a learner. And that advocacy can become really powerful in the workplace and in education if you're coming from a place of good information and predictable positive results. So over the course of the whole year, that's the goal of our teachers, is to build that trust, build that understanding, and then lead it to advocacy, which will happen inside the classroom, then will further happen when they move on to post-secondary and they're able to advocate for themselves and say, here's what I need. I need, isolation when I'm doing an exam. I need a little bit of extra time. I need things in audio format, or I need the notes in advance. These are all really simple accommodations that will support deeper cognition and overall retention, honestly, of information. The day over day approach is pretty systematic. I mean, we have things called TA meetings. So, and we do this in the workplace as well, particularly when we're remote, like in the summer and in our business office, is you have a daily meeting starting at 8:30. It's generally a catch-up time. You spend a little time socializing, but there's a structure to it. So it's about deeper connection, trust, all those things. And then setting up the day. So here are the tasks you need to complete throughout the day. Here's where you find them. Here's where I'm at if you need a little bit of support. So there's that opportunity to connect person to person throughout the day. And then again, at the end of the day, catching up and just asking those questions, what did you accomplish? What do you wish you had done better? How can I support you in getting there? And I think those connections are enough to keep students, connected and moving forward. And I think similarly for corporations and for workforces, I think one thing I picked up, and I think it was from Cynic or one of those writers, was, the magic questions that I ask my direct reports once a week, and I send it out on Sunday is, what's your priority this week? And how can I support you? And it comes out in an email Sunday or Monday morning, I suppose. And they just respond, and I know exactly where they're at and what they need from me. And then we go ahead. We've now eliminated, probably 80% of our meetings that would just be information sharing meetings. And we've moved into a more generative space where we don't have to get caught up on what you're working on and how I can support you. Instead, we're talking about ideas and how do we advance our organization or education as a whole.
Yeah. And yeah, I love that. And I see that in pockets throughout the industry. And I think it comes from a different mindset. Is educators have the mindset of learning, helping people learn, grow, and improve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think in the corporate world, a lot of leaders are so focused on outcomes and delivering quarterly numbers or reaching an objective that they forget, and they might understand it intuitively, but they forget that it's helping people learn and grow that's going to help do that.
Yeah.
And so what you're talking about is very straightforward and simple from an education standpoint, but I think corporate leadership is sometimes forgets that. And great leaders, I wouldn't say do it intuitively, but they've learned that that's maybe their superpower, and that's how they have progressed, or help people progress. Yeah, it was just struck out when you were saying that about how I think coming from an education background, it seems straightforward and natural to you and to your team.
Well, I think, some of the reading or research I've done over the years in leadership, whether it's education or corporate, comes back to, first defining and I'm positive you've talked about this on your podcast before, but I mean, defining your organizational culture out of the gates. What kind of culture do you want to have? I think, culture will lead strategy, which will lead results. So ultimately, if you start with culture and ask yourself, do you want to have a culture of learning? Do you want to have a culture of results, authority, safety, purpose? What is it you're striving for? I think being explicit in that culture to the people you work with, so your leadership team and your employees, brings a better awareness and a congruence between, the organizational objectives. And again, the objectives, just where I come from, I think have to be rooted in culture, and then outcome and results come from that. And once you've got that culture nailed down and everybody understands it, then you can hire with purpose. And when you hire with purpose, you get purposeful employees who really buy into that cultural objective, and ultimately have more buy-in to the overall organization. However, back to education, one of the biggest challenges there is sometimes I don't think people have deep enough personal awareness as to who they are in their own learning or their own work to fully realize, what kind of culture is going to work for them. So if you have employees who are results oriented and are focused in on that, and you're a results oriented culture, you've got great congruence. And I think you're going to see at the end of the day, a pretty healthy workplace. But if you have, employees who are interested in learning first, but your organization is all about, safety, you're probably going to have an incongruence, which is going to create an overall conflict in your workplace. So I think, start with organizational culture. Secondly, move to personal awareness of your employees, but also having them buy in on that cultural underpinning as to what you're working on, keeping open dialogue around, where that congruence lies. And finally, just like, regular check-ins with every employee that you work with, I think are keys to, leading organizations in that cultural way.
And I love that. And you said if we've talked about it on previous podcasts about culture, yeah, absolutely. And I think we could talk about it on every single episode because it's so important. And yet so many organizations lose that vision. They've some corporate plaque up on the wall that's got dust on it, and you survey 100 people in the organization and none of them can tell you the core values. And none of them can give you an example of how those core values are being expressed by employees on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, a lot of the conflict in companies comes from the values mean nothing. They talk about this, but people act in a completely different way. And it was one of the things that struck me about Rundle when I was looking on the website is the R+ and the pathway to learning. It's clear. It's right there. Here's how we do what we do, and here's why we do what we do. That's not rocket science, but living it and breathing it on a day-to-day basis is what creates the change. And as you said, hire based on values, hire based on the desired culture that you want to create. And while that every business coach and business training program out there talks about that, once you get into the day-to-day, it's much harder to live by that. And especially when people are so busy that they can't even know which way is up, trying to think about, does this fit with the values, gets so lost. So how do you see being able to keep that in the front of mind?
Well, I think, it comes back to a book written by Tony Hsieh, who's now passed, but Delivering Happiness is founder of Zappos, right? And I remember him talking in that book about paying people to quit before they start. And so, they would do the 2-week training process. And if they didn't like it, he would give them, I can't remember, $10,000, $15,000 not to take the job and walk away. And ultimately 15% of people would walk away and 85% would stay. And that's the way it was. But, I think it's got to be the same in every one of our pre-employment communication opportunities, frankly. And so, we spend a lot of time in pre-employment talking about our values, talking about, here's who Rundle is: kind, curious, well. Academic integrity is really important. That's at the core of what we do. Character, but character comes first, and co-curriculars are the balance. And co-curriculars, here's what we expect of you as an employee, X, Y, and Z. And then put it back to them, say, do you think you can live inside these values and these constructs seriously? Because the organization is not going to change, and you're probably not going to change dramatically. And if there's an incongruence between the organization and you, then your work-life balance is going to be off, because you're not going to be satisfied. You're not going to enjoy the work, and we need you to enjoy the work because it's not easy, right? Like working in education anywhere is tough work. So value congruence is essential if you're going to be healthy. And I think that upfront work is so important, but also so undervalued. So often we're in such a rush to get somebody in who can do the job. But can we get somebody in who's going to do the job in a way that's value congruent, and full of purpose. And that's the real question we have to ask ourselves pre-employment. And I think we do that well. I think oftentimes we get asked, how do you hire the teachers that you have? Because that certainly seems to be part of the secret sauce over here at Rundle. And I think it just comes back to value congruence and being crystal clear with people pre-employment.
Absolutely, yeah. It's and again, leaders that do that well build great teams. And I think there's still so much that gets lost in larger organizations where perhaps there's been a gap between conveying the mission, vision, values of the organization, or at least in a way that is compelling for people to buy into. If they're not excited about it outside of a paycheck, that it's going to be a challenge long term. And while organizations do, especially these days, sometimes just need bodies to fill a spot, that's never a good strategy for long-term success.
Yeah. And I was thinking back to a conversation I heard you having once about, I think it was about chief performance officers and HR being at the table at the, I think, the big people table. And I think that's absolutely critical, is having that voice sitting at the C-suite table and having equal representation, I think can drive culture, can drive purpose, can drive, overall organizational well-being. And I think having somebody in charge of that and looking out for it, can help, shrink the organization. I think, some of what we've been talking about today is how do you take a big-ish organization and shrink it so that people feel seen, heard, valued, understood. And I think you do that by having the right people at the table. And I think ultimately, having human resources at that decision-making table with equal opportunity, I think is a great first start when we're looking at creating great organizations.
Yeah. And being able to strategically plan for that. I think it was Bo Burlingham or whatever, Small Giants is the book. And he talks about companies that choose to be great, not necessarily big. And he talks about, I think it's W.L. Gore, the company that makes Gore-Tex and things like that. And their strategy was, I think they broke the company up into multiple units of 150 people because 150 people is sort of the average that you can know everyone's name and sort of know personal things about them. So every time the company grew above 150, he would split it and it kept going. And so he has all these business units that are essentially small little companies within the larger organization that still live by the values, but the leaders and teams within those units all have these personal connections with each other, which has kept retention through the roof and they're one of the most they're a private company, so they don't know the profitability, but they've been around for a lot of years and they're doing quite well, and they've grown dramatically, yet still have maintained a culture that is enviable across all kinds of aspects of the industry.
Well, I think, he's referring to Dunbar's number, and you're right. I think that like 150 is a really important number. We try to, at Rundle, we continue to break this school into smaller schools. And so there are 7 principals at Rundle, and all of them have schools around that, 150 to 200 student number to keep it close, keep it connected. And, one of the greatest compliments that anybody ever provides us, like they always come up and say, like, Rundle's really small and that's why we love it. But the fact of the matter is, Rundle's inside the top 1% of largest private schools in Canada. And so, the fact that people perceive us as being small means we're, achieving that objective of staying connected, staying personalized. And we do it through, following exactly that kind of Dunbar's number logic. And the other one that is really interesting, that same vein of thinking is, there's a study done, I think it was in the 70s, and it's basically, it's called the Allen curve. And the Allen curve says, if you're more than 8 meters away from any individual, your level of impact on them diminishes exponentially every meter you go away. So I think when we think about designing workspaces, not only do they have to be small, but they have to be connected. So, how closely is your team actually working to you? Where this is a giant challenge is back to the virtual space, is how do you shrink the virtual distance to reach that objective of the Allen curve, which is 8 meters. And I think that's the biggest challenge inside virtual workspaces, is how do you shrink the space? And so, we look at the Allen curve all the time here. So for instance, when we do mentors and we want to have somebody inducted into our program and have a successful induction, we make sure the classroom is no more than 8 meters from their mentee's classroom. And same thing with our internal teams. I can tell you that effectively my CFO and my COO sit within 8 meters of where I'm standing right now, and it's all very intentional in our design. So balancing Dunbar and Allen, I think, are really important for developing strong and connected workplace cultures.
Yeah. And how far is 8 virtual meters?
Yeah, that's the real question. I mean, figure that one out, Tim. You're on to something.
Well, and yeah, I don't see remote work going away anytime soon. And how do we best curate that environment to create personalized connections? And I know even just through doing this podcast, I started it during COVID as a way to just have great conversations with people. And we're further than 8 actual meters away, but we can still create a great connection. I've had so many incredible conversations, but it's taking the time to sit there and ask questions and learn and have great dialogue back and forth. And that's always been the case, whether we're in person or virtual.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's that's a question, Tim. I don't know if it's teachable or not, but there's an art to it, right? And I think in your background of coaching, that art of conversation and extracting the best from the person you're working with, there's an art to it. So maybe there's a place in virtual corporate workspace where that art is explicitly taught to people to try to, create that 8 meter distance virtually. That'd be an interesting thing to think about, kind of as you build, effective distant workspaces post-COVID.
Yeah, and I think there's huge potential for that. Like, people are having virtual meetings all day, every day, but it's approaching it from a different mindset. When you're so focused on that outcome or hey, here's what we need to chat about this meeting, being able to schedule those one-on-ones, even when your calendar is just so packed, to be able to consciously carve out 15 minutes, 30 minutes to meet with a direct report and not talk about work, to just ask questions and really engage with them in a conversation, goes so far. And I know from coaching clients that I've talked to and consulting clients that I've talked to, that's not the norm. It's not happening on a consistent basis to build those relationships, whether in person or virtually.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 things that jump to mind there, Tim, when you say that. I don't know if you ever heard the story about President Obama and Joe Biden when they're in the Oval Office for 8 years together. Effectively, the way the story goes is that every 2 weeks in the Oval Office, Obama and Biden would meet for lunch. And there were 2 rules. One was they wouldn't discuss work. And 2, there were no outcomes that would come from it. There'd be no takeaway work. They just effectively sit and have lunch and connect. And it always struck me that if Biden and Obama, the 2 busiest, most powerful people maybe in the world, could take, a lunch together and just connect every 2 weeks, why can't we in our workplaces do the same thing? And so we do a thing called trail snacks around here. And Rundle's named after a mountain, so almost everything's mountain metaphor here. So that's why we call it trail snacks. But trail snacks is a rotating meeting that I have with about 10 people in our organization, and it's got the same 2 rules. We're not going to talk about work, and we're not going to have any takeaways. Now, invariably, we talk about work because that's, how we connect. But at the end of the day, that's not the focus. And we usually do it, we'll do it walking or do it over lunch or do it over coffee. And at first it's a little bit awkward, honestly, because, when you're at work, you're programmed to work. You want to get down to what's on the agenda, what's deliverable, what do we have to do today, what are we going to tick off. But these have been really, really great moments for connection and for understanding and building trust and deepening our empathy with one another. So that's really the biggest one that comes to mind when we talk about how do we connect with individuals at work. So yeah, that I think is a really powerful takeaway. The second thing that I was thinking about there is I've got a guy in my office who's my deputy head of school, and he's not much on small talk. And so when we get into meetings, he just like show up and get to work. And I remember saying to him, Gary, does it bother you when like I ask about what you did on the weekend or your family or those sorts of things? And he said, no, it doesn't bother me, but I'm focused on getting the work done. So I feel better if we just get to work and get some of the work done. And what came from that was he ended up sending out a survey to all of his direct reports and saying, how do you want to meet? I'm flexible, but I want to hear how do you like small talk? Do you like talking about your family? Do you want to connect on X, Y, and Z? Do you music in the background? Is that okay? All of these things. People sent back all of their requests for like how we like to meet. And all of a sudden, I think people are showing up a little bit more regularly. They're a little bit more engaged. They're more looking forward to it because he'd come to them and said, exactly how do you want to meet? And I think building that understanding, and back to like the neurodiversity, all of us work differently, whether we identify as being neurally diverse or not. My brain is different than your brain, is different than my CFO's brain. And I think, asking what is going on in our brains or what works for our brains is the best way to getting to that space of like awareness and empathy and understanding that I think is so critical in today's day and age. And so I think those are a couple of takeaways as well.
I love that. And it comes back to, it's the heart of well-being in personally and professionally, is knowing yourself, first of all. And you mentioned it earlier, not a lot of people have been taught how to do that. Mm-hmm. They haven't been taught to hold that mirror up and look and, contemplate internally, how do I show up best in the world? What do I really want? Mm-hmm. What do I need to perform at my optimal level? And, coming from the athletics background, that was something that was drilled into us from a young age from the performance side, but I never got that from the personal side as much, and until much later in my career. And when I figured that out, it became one of the things that I really worked with clients on. And I still see that as probably one of the biggest gaps in the corporate world right now, is that there's this mindset of you show up to work from 9 to 5 or whatever the hours are, and you're focused, you go the whole time. And it's like saying to someone, hey, you got a marathon here. I want you to sprint as fast as you can for that entire marathon.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's okay to stop and take a breath.
Yeah.
And that if you go out and walk around the block or go stand in the sun and take a few deep breaths and come back in, you're probably going to be more efficient and effective doing that. And I think I was happy to hear you saying that the students these days are much more focused on well-being and caring for their health and mind, physical and mental health. I see that as a huge opportunity for the corporate world at this point.
Well, and I think, so you reminded me, there's a book called The End of Average. I don't know if you've come across, by a guy named Todd Rose, and he's a professor at the Harvard School of Education, Graduate School of Education. And he wrote this book probably 5 or 6 years ago now. And the premise is really powerful. It started off with, in 1920, they created cockpits for fighter pilots based on the average size of a man. And in 1950s, they started to note there's a lot more crashes, fatal incidents, and they decided that maybe the average size of the man had changed, and so they wanted to redesign the cockpit for the new average. So they went out and they did extensive study of 4,000 pilots and came up with the average height, weight, arm length, neck size, everything, and said, okay, we're going to design for this average person in the cockpit. Well, they designed for that average, but guess how many people out of 4,000 it actually fit? 0. Not a single pilot out of the 4,000 that were sampled was the average. It was a summary of all these people, and it didn't work. So what they decided they had to do after much trial and tribulation was they had to create a cockpit that would adapt to the differences for every pilot that was out there. So how did they do that? They created a seat that went backwards and forwards, up and down. They created instruments that came to the pilot or went away from the pilot. They created different equipment for the pilot to wear, based on their individual size. And all of a sudden, the safety ratings started to improve again. But what they found was the average isn't useful when we talk about how do we, work with people, or how do people work best. And so thinking about that average is really challenging. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we face is there's a certain shame that we carry around when we don't think we're part of the average, when we don't think we're part of the norm, right? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have is if we, as soon as you're outside that norm, particularly as an adolescent, you start to feel shame, then you start to feel embarrassed, and you start to, act out or turn inward. None of these are really positive in the well-being space. And so I think by embracing the fact that, the end of average, as Todd Rose says, is really empowering for students in adolescence, but also for employees, saying, just like you said about the marathon example, is like, if you need to get up and take a walk and come back and be better that way, or if you need to meet in a certain way, or what do you need within, obviously corporate boundaries, which would fall into what we were talking about earlier around cultural expectations, then go for it. Do what you need to do, but you got to have that self-awareness before you do it. And you can't aspire to be the average or the norm, because that's an illusion, frankly, and doesn't exist. And so The End of Average is just a really enlightening, quite empowering book for this day and age.
I will have to check that out.
That's great.
I've heard the cockpit story before, but I haven't heard that book. So yeah. I'll have to look it up. What you're saying about embracing not being the norm, I guess goes back to what you talked about in your TEDx talk was your superpowers and how to become aware of it and embrace it, and what teachers' roles and I guess leaders' roles in general is to help people bring those superpowers out more. So what do you see as, I know we could talk for a long time, but what do you see as the next step in education?
Yeah, I think, the reason I pause on that, Tim, is like we have a bit of a conflict in education. I think curriculum is antiquated and is moving too slowly for the kind of change curve we're on in society. Professions are changing more quickly than curriculum can keep up with. Knowledge is changing more quickly than curriculum can keep up with. So I think, for me, what it comes back to is an agility of thought, an agility of mind that is truly the superpower that we can provide to our students and to our workforce, frankly, is this ability to be agile in our thinking and in the way that we approach problems, way we approach our life, way we approach living, frankly. And so, this coming year in our Rundle programs, we're starting a new initiative called Ideas. And Ideas is effectively, saying like, okay, the curriculum is there. It's not going to change. There are some things we've got to get done. And I mean, you could easily transpose this onto your KPIs or your objectives in a corporate organization. But Ideas is layering on top of it, trying to inspire that idea of curiosity that's so central to our values. And what Ideas stands for is innovation, design, entrepreneurial spirit, and skills. So that's ideas, design, entrepreneurial spirit, and skills. And we're looking to layer that on top of the curriculum to create an agility of thinking that's going to allow our students to solve, as cliche as it sounds, those problems that we don't even know exist, right? And several of them we know exist, we just don't know how to solve them. And I think we're going to need some really intuitive, agile, outside the box thinkers to help unwind some of the challenges that we face in today's, society, economy, environment, you name it. So I think, just generally agility of thought is what's going to be required, and the best gift we can give to students moving ahead.
I love that. Yeah. And that speaks to some of the key challenges that the traditional education system has is memorizing certain facts and not teaching people how to think. And, the best gift we can give someone is to teach them how to think and learn. And when you can do that, everything's possible. Totally. I agree entirely, Tim. I think, thinking and learning, that seems so simple, but that should be, that should be the outcome of all education. Totally. Yeah. Well, and then you get into the corporate world and the mindset is often don't think, just do. Yeah. That's pretty industrial, really. I mean, and I think, a lot of, from what I understand, corporations are looking to move past, but I agree there's a lot that are absolutely stuck in that space. And, I'm optimistic, though. I think everything's moving in the right direction when it comes to education and leadership, I hope. Yeah. And leaders that don't adapt and organizations that don't adapt will be left behind. Yeah. And the dodo birds. You got it. Awesome. Well, it's been wonderful to chat. I look forward to reconnecting again and continuing the conversation. But thank you so much, Jason. And where can people find you? You can just find me on, Twitter or most social media at Jason B. Rogers is the easiest way. It's X now. Oh, Elon Musk changed the name. Yeah, he changed the name of Twitter to X. Okay. You can find me there. And I've got a website, drjbrogers.com. And you can find some of my writing and thinking on research and leadership there as well. So anytime. And just reach out in those mediums. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today with you, Tim. Thanks for having me as a guest. My pleasure. And I will make sure I put those links on the show notes, and we will chat again soon. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Tim. Take care. That wraps up another episode of the Working Well podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Which guests or topics would you like to see featured on the show? Message me through LinkedIn or on the contact page of timboris.com. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Tim Boris with Fresh Group, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode.